Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and on today's episode, we will be discussing another poem, another John Keats poem specifically, Keats's 1819 Ode to Psyche. So this is another one of Keats's famous odes. We discussed Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode to a Nightingale in previous episodes. Much like those two poems, this ode has similar themes about the imagination, and as always, it uses Keats's signature, dreamy, sensory, beautiful, lyrical language and lyrical rhythms and structure. Before we get started, I just want to quickly announce that my second novel, Grand Tour, is coming out this September. It's a novel about a young man who travels Europe at age 23 in the summer of 2012, looking at great art and trying to understand the meaning of life and figure out his own future. It's a novel set in the world of European backpacker hostels, and it follows the intellectual and artistic development of a young person. I'm going to be doing the audiobook as well, so you'll see that in September. Along with the release. All right, with that, let's turn to Ode to Psyche. So, as I often say, I don't necessarily like the idea that poetry requires a lot of prior knowledge. I sometimes like to emphasize that you can, with a lot of great poems, understand them as texts themselves. This poem, I do believe, you do need to know to really understand what Keats is doing and saying. It helps to know a little bit about Psyche. Psyche was a Greek goddess, and the word Psyche essentially translates to soul. You could think of it as the soul, the spirit, the life force. In Greek mythology, Psyche was the lover of Eros or Cupid. You've probably seen in museums lots of paintings of Cupid and Psyche, or Eros and Psyche. You know, today we use the word psyche in a more abstracted psychological way, thanks to psychologists of the late 19th and early 20th century. But I think there is an obvious connection between psyche as an internal state and Psyche as the Greek goddess of the soul. And in fact, I believe Keats's poem is drawing this connection between the ancient Greek world and the modern internal world. That, I think, is the big theme of the poem. The way the externalized spiritual values of the Greeks become internalized in the 19th century, and the way that sort of spirituality moves inward. I think it's a very insightful and very interesting way of thinking about the soul, thinking about imagination, thinking about the power of the soul and its connection to love, but also of the continuity between the Greek world and our world. I think that's part of what makes this poem so interesting and insightful. So one thing about Ode to Psyche, unlike some of his previous odes, I would say Ode to Psyche is much more loosely structured. There are 5 stanzas, but the stanzas all have varying lengths. Not every stanza is the same length, and though the poem is primarily in iambic pentameter, there are lines that vary that rhythm throughout the poem and create this more dynamic effect. We talked a little bit about this dynamic effect when we talked about Ode to a Nightingale. Though even Ode to a Nightingale, the short lines always appeared at the same point in every stanza. That is not the case here. So Ode to Psyche is a little more loosely structured. There's not as much of a clear, as we talked about with Nightingale and with Ode on a Grecian Urn, there were these clear divisions within the stanzas between the beginning and the end, as divided by the rhyme schemes. In Ode to Psyche, the rhyme schemes don't necessarily divide the stanzas so cleanly and clearly. But I think the structural power of the poem comes from the stanzas' varying lengths and the way they relate to one another. And I think the final stanza, as we're going to see, is sort of this, I almost think of it as this explosive opening up of the imagination and of spiritual power. And it has that effect when you read it. And part of this is because the last stanza is the longest stanza. But, as always, let's begin at the beginning, and let's read this poem and break down, close read, the images, the structure, the musicality, as we always do. O goddess, hear these tuneless numbers, rung by sweet enforcement and remembrance dear, and pardon that thy secrets should be sung even into thine own soft-conched ear. Surely I dreamt today, or did I see the winged Psyche with awakened eyes? I wandered in a forest thoughtlessly, and, on the sudden, fainting with surprise, saw two fair creatures, couched side by side, in deepest grass, beneath the whispering roof of leaves and trembled blossoms, where there ran a brooklet, scarce espied. All right, so we have a kind of invocation to the goddess at the beginning. O goddess. There's a similarity here to a lot of Greek poetry, a lot of the poetry of the Greek world, like Homer. You begin with an invocation to the muse. O muse, sing muse, tell me muse. So we have something similar, except for Keats, who is his muse? Who is the goddess he is singing to? It is not one of the muses, the goddesses who are associated with poetic and artistic inspiration. Instead, it is Psyche who is his muse. Psyche, the soul. This is very much in line with Romanticism as a movement. Where does artistic inspiration come from? For the Romantic poets like John Keats, it comes from inside. It comes from the soul. It comes from you as an individual, right? Poetry is self-expression. Poetry is your soul expressing itself. You don't need, according to the Romantics, you don't need formal training or education. You don't need an external force such as a goddess or a muse. The muse is your psyche. The muse comes from inside you. So right off the bat, in the first two words, we get Keats's argument, essentially, in this poem, that poetic inspiration that the Greeks believed came from the gods, came from outside, now, in the 19th century, in what we think of as a more modern world, to use that word broadly, comes from inside, comes from the soul, comes internally, right? It's the internalization of what was once external. The deities and the goddesses and the gods in the Greek world who were outside, they are now inside. They are in your soul, and that is the source of inspiration, the psyche. And so Keats invokes the psyche at the very beginning of his poem. Now, this next phrase, hear these tuneless numbers, rung by sweet enforcement and remembrance dear. I think he's talking about poems. You could argue a poem is a tuneless number because, so this is the other contrast with the Greek world, right? In the Greek world, poetry was sung, right? It is Homer singing as a bard. The idea of a poetic bard, the idea of a bard was you play a musical instrument, you sing. It is an oral tradition. In Keats's 19th century, poetry is no longer an oral tradition. Poetry is now written down. Poems have become tuneless numbers. They are no longer sung. They are no longer heard. They are now tuneless. So once again, it's that movement from the outside to the inside. What was externalized in the Greek world, singing a song to the muse, poetry, oral tradition, has now become internalized, a tuneless number, a silent poem, essentially. More than that, though, if you remember when we discussed Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode to a Nightingale, Keats really drew this contrast between the sensory world and the imagination. He really emphasized that the imagination was in many ways more powerful than the sensory world, right? The music that you cannot hear, that is being played on the urn, is greater than actual music that your ear can hear, right? The music that the nightingale sings is beyond simple human perception, human sensory perception. So he's doing something similar here. He's talking about tuneless numbers to talk, I think, about poetry, about his poems, but also to celebrate a kind of art that goes beyond the senses, which is in some ways what poetry is to Keats, right? And he says that poetry is wrung by sweet enforcement and remembrance dear. Wrung, I think, it's kind of a metaphor to describe what it's like to write poetry. It feels like you have to wring out the poems by sweet enforcement and remembrance, right? Your memory as well. And so then, he's speaking to the muse, he's speaking to Psyche, and he says he had a dream in which he saw Psyche and presumably Cupid, Psyche's consort, right, Eros, love, in the forest, side by side. Now, this is a classic Keats setting, a beautiful forest and a dream. These are images Keats returns to over and over again in his poems, a dream and a forest. For Keats, the dream and the forest are often connected. Forests, symbolically, were always these slightly unreal threshold spaces between our world and another world, right? Between reality and the kind of fairy, fae dreamscape. So Keats invokes that same set of images when he's describing the dream he had of Psyche. So once again, though, think of this contrast between the external and the internal. Where does a dream take place? A dream takes place in your head. And yet, in Keats's head, how does he visualize or imagine the soul? He imagines it as external to himself. It's as if he's finding his soul in a forest. He's finding Psyche in the forest, seated side by side with love. And so I think it's this complex interplay between the inner world and the outer world. Keats is emphasizing that this is all happening in his head, in his dream. This is a dramatization of what is happening in his head, a dream, but he is using the imagery of the Greek world in order to show us what this inner kind of wrestling with his own psychology is like. It is as if he is wandering thoughtlessly in a forest and he runs into Psyche and Cupid side by side. And we have all of the imagery associated with the kind of pastoral, Arcadian Greek world. Deepest grass, the whispering roof of leaves, right? They don't need to be indoors in a house because the forest is their roof. The blossoms, the brooklet, the blossoms are trembling, the leaves are trembling. Very sensual, very suggestive, a kind of classic image that by now we've seen a lot of in Keats's poetry. If we read the next stanza, mid hushed, cool-rooted flowers, fragrant-eyed, blue, silver-white, and budded Tyrian, they lay calm-breathing on the bedded grass, their arms embraced, and their pinions too. Their lips touched not, but had not bade adieu, as if disjoined by soft-handed slumber, and ready still past kisses to outnumber, at tender eye-dawn of Aurorian love, the winged boy I knew. But who wast thou, O happy, happy dove, his Psyche true? So this is the stanza where he identifies Psyche, right? He realizes that this figure that he saw in the dream was Psyche, alongside Cupid or Eros, right? The winged boy. But let's look at the details and the images he gives us. Again, a lot of sensory images. So think about, again, that interplay between the external and the internal. If this is all a description of an internal state, a dream he has had, Keats nevertheless wants to externalize and describe the dream as if he is outside in the world. So he uses sensory details, as he often does. Hushed, cool-rooted flowers. The word hushed is good because it's almost like the flowers are silent. Obviously, the flowers are hushed. Flowers don't make a sound. It personifies the flowers. It also makes us imagine sort of this soundscape, right? This silent hush in the forest as Keats comes upon these two lovers, Cupid and Psyche. The flowers are also cool-rooted, right? So we have a sensory detail associated with not just sound, the hush, but also touch. They are fragrant-eyed, right? So they smell nice. They are fragrant. And then he describes the colors: blue, silver-white, not just white, but silver-white, and budded Tyrian. So Tyrian, I believe, is a reference to the city of Tyre, the ancient city of Tyre in the Mediterranean. And I believe it was a place where a famous purple dye used to come from. So it's a description that is associated with a particular type of purple color, Tyrian. And so he's describing the colors of the flowers that he sees. And then notice how he describes Cupid and Psyche. They are not kissing. They're embracing, but they're not kissing. Their lips are not touching, but he emphasizes that they could kiss. They're about to kiss, ready still past kisses to outnumber. And he describes their love as tender eye dawn of Aurorian love. So he really wants to emphasize that their love is new. It is like the dawn. It is like the morning. It is tender. It is still young. There are still a lot of kisses in their future to have. He wants to emphasize this idea of youthful love in describing these two. And of course, obviously, flowers are also associated with a certain youthful freshness. And so, what are the emotions we're setting up so far? Again, if this is a poem describing Keats's newfound love and kind of his relationship with his own soul, he is externalizing his own union with his soul as coming upon his soul lying in a forest next to the Greek god of love. But again, keep in mind that tension, that sort of connection between the external and the internal, externalizing through forest imagery and description the internal state of one getting in touch with one's soul, because that is, of course, the heart of this poem. Now, let's read the next stanza. O latest born and loveliest vision far of all Olympus' faded hierarchy, fairer than Phoebe's sapphire-regioned star, or Vesper, amorous glowworm of the sky, fairer than these, though temple thou hast none, nor altar heaped with flowers, nor virgin choir to make delicious moan upon the midnight hours, no voice, no lute, no pipe, no incense sweet, from chain-swung censer teeming, no shrine, no grove, no oracle, no heat of pale-mouthed prophet dreaming. So we get in the stanza some of that rhythmic alteration that I talked about. We have long lines, right? Classic iambic pentameter lines, followed by short lines. No shrine, no grove, no oracle, no heat, right? That's classic iambic pentameter. Da-dun, 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 right? 5 beats alternating unstressed, stressed syllables. And then of pale-mouthed prophet dreaming is not iambic pentameter. So we have this alternation which creates this kind of musicality, this up and down, this wave-like motion, which is classic aspect of a lot of Keats's poems, but he does it so nicely and fluidly in this one. The structure is a lot more, as I said before, the structure is a lot more fluid and loose. What are the images in this stanza that he emphasizes? So he wants to emphasize, first of all, that Psyche is the latest, the last-born and loveliest of all Olympus's faded hierarchy. In other words, Psyche is a Greek goddess, but she is one of the newest and latest Greek goddesses that was created, that was envisioned by writers. And what he's essentially implying is that by the time Psyche came around, by the time they kind of personified Psyche as a goddess, Olympus was already fading. The Greek gods were already fading. This is going to be an important theme in this poem. Keats really emphasizes that the Greek world, the Greek gods and goddesses, the divinity, the divine power of these gods and goddesses faded. It vanished. It went away. Psyche was the last of them, and he says the thing about Psyche is, even though, first of all, he compares Psyche to two other Greek goddesses. Phoebe, so Phoebe is associated with light, with brightness. Sometimes the sun, sometimes the moon. Sometimes she is connected with Apollo and Artemis. And then Vesper, described as the amorous glowworm of the sky. I believe Vesper is supposed to be the planet Venus, the bright sort of image of the planet Venus. So that's that very evocative phrase, amorous glowworm of the sky. Really evocative way of describing the planet Venus. But what Keats is saying here is, okay, we have these two bright spots in the night sky. We have, the sun and the moon. We have Venus, right? We have these essentially these brightnesses that we can see visibly with our eyes. And he's saying, actually, Psyche is fairer than both of these, fairer than Phoebe and fairer than Vesper. So again, it's that contrast between the inner and the outer. Keats is quite literally saying the soul is brighter than the bright planets that we can see in the sky, than the literal celestial bodies that we see in the sky. That is a pretty dramatic shift. Keats is, and I think it represents the larger kind of intellectual shift that essentially occurred over Western history. The movement from kind of externalized, from locating divinity in the external, in the bright spots that you see in the sky, to locating divinity internally, in your own soul. And that's what Keats is saying here, that actually, even though Psyche is the latest of the goddesses, the latest of Olympus's fated hierarchy, she is the loveliest, she is the best, she is the fairest, she is fairer than those literal bright spots in the sky. And then he describes that she is fair even though she does not have a temple. So he goes on to describe, and this entire section of the poem now, this entire section of the stanza, it's all negative, right? He emphasizes a series of images and objects that Psyche does not have. There is no altar heaped with flowers, no virgin choir, no voice, no lute, no pipe, no incense, no shrine, no grove, no oracle, no heat of pale-mouthed prophet dreaming. So these are all images that are traditionally associated with worship in the Greek world. An altar that you heap with flowers, a virgin choir, and this is such a wonderful phrase, to make delicious moan upon the midnight hours. It's a very sexual image, very sensual image to associate with a choir singing in praise to a god and goddess. That's a classic Keats image, right? Associating certain prophetic, divine rituals in the Greek world with a certain almost animalistic sensuality. Notice all of the sensory details here. The altar heaped with flowers. We've already established flowers have a visual component. They're bright, they're colorful. They also have a fragrant component. They smell nice. The virgin choir is making delicious moan upon the midnight hours. You can hear it. It's a sound detail. Voice, lute, pipe, those are all sound details associated with music, right? The worship that Greek gods and goddesses would be given. And then, of course, incense, sweet, right? Incense is another sensory detail associated with smell, right? The incense from a censer. And then finally, no heat of pale-mouthed prophet dreaming. There's no heat. So he's literally saying all of the sensory pleasures, all of the sensory images we associate with worship in the ancient Greek world do not exist for Psyche. She has none of these things because she came too late. She was a goddess who was created after the Greek world was already disappearing, after Olympus's hierarchy was already fading. Now this is important though because we're about to read the next stanza in which he flips it. So think, though, about what he's saying so far about external versus internal. He is saying Psyche does not have all of these external attributes of worship. She does not have a temple with all of these external sensory descriptions. But then let's look at the next stanza. O brightest, thou too late for antique vows, too late for the fond believing lyre, when holy with a haunted forest boughs, holy the air, the water, and the fire. Yet even in these days so far retired from happy pieties, thy lucent fans, fluttering among the faint Olympians, I see and sing by my own eyes inspired. So let me be thy choir, and make a moan upon the midnight hours. Thy voice, thy lute, thy pipe, thy incense sweet, from swinged censer teeming, thy shrine, thy grove, thy oracle, thy heat, of pale-mouthed prophet dreaming. So this is one of my favorite stanzas of the poem. Probably not my favorite, actually, because I think the last stanza is quite remarkable. But this is where it really gets going, right? Where we really see what the point that he's making. At the beginning, he says, once again, he returns to that idea that Psyche was too late. So the structure here actually very much mirrors the structure of the previous stanza. And the rhyme scheme echoes this distinction, this division, right? The first, essentially, 4 lines, vows, lyre, bows, fire, in this stanza. And in the previous stanza, it was far, hierarchy, star, sky, right? Hierarchy and sky are meant to rhyme. It's what we call an I rhyme. Of course, the I rhyme makes sense because remember, these are tuneless numbers. These are not meant to be sung, but meant to be seen. The point is, right, we have 4 rhyming lines at the beginning of this stanza. This is the third and fourth stanza. We have 4 rhyming lines at the beginning, followed by additional lines that sort of develop basically the theme, but in contrasting ways. So just as in the third stanza, in the fourth stanza, the first 4 lines emphasize that the Olympian world has faded. We have some great images here to describe the fading of the Greek religion, right? So we have, first of all, this image of the fond, believing liar. So again, he's describing the Greek world in which belief was externalized. Belief was a lyre, right? That was plucked and played. It was music. The point is, in the Greek world, faith, divinity, religiosity, piety was externalized. It was a lyre being plucked. It was sound. And he says the haunted forest boughs were holy in the Greek world. So again, forests, right? We have forest imagery. Remember, he came upon Psyche and Cupid in his dream in a forest. So the forest is associated with the holy, haunted Greek world, right? In the Greek world, the forest was full of gods and goddesses and nymphs and dryads and half-divine creatures. We have basically this emphasis that, again, in the Greek world, belief was externalized. Religion, divinity was externalized. You could go into the forest, and that was where you could encounter something holy. Holy, the air, the water, and the fire. All external elements, right? Air, water, fire, and earth. All 4 elements together are holy. In the Greek world, Keats is saying holiness was externalized. Holiness was the literal elements that make up the world. And then what does he say now? He says, today, obviously, we're far away from that. We're far retired from happy pieties. Even still, Psyche's lucent fans fluttering among the faint Olympians, I see and sing. Lucent means bright. So he sort of says, like, even though we live in a world in which the Greek, the pieties of the Greek world have faded, he can still see Psyche's lucent fans. How does he see them? He doesn't see them literally or physically in the external world. He says, I see and sing by my own eyes inspired. So he emphasizes, obviously, when we see something in the physical world, we see with our eyes, obviously. I think Keats is he has a double meaning here. When he says, by my own eyes inspired, he wants to emphasize that he, John Keats, the poet, he can still see Psyche's brightness. He's acknowledging other people might not be able to see it. He's emphasizing subjectivity here, right? In the Greek world, as he said in the previous stanza, belief was somewhat objective. You had these objective sensory realities that represented belief. Sounds and sights and smells, right? Altars with flowers and incense, virgin choirs singing. Now, we don't have any of that anymore. All of that has disappeared. But some people, like Keats, can still see Psyche. Only what they see is not external anymore, it is internal. It is not objective, but subjective. And then he takes the same set of images from the previous stanza and flips them. So remember, in the previous stanza, it was all negation. No shrine, no grove, no oracle. Now Keats says, yes, there are these things. All of these things still exist, but what is the word that is repeated here, right? It is the word thy. Let me be thy choir, thy voice, thy lute, thy pipe. It is subjective. He is saying, it might not exist objectively out in the world, but I can be that person for you. He is saying to Psyche, to his own soul, let me worship you. Let me do all of the things that in the Greek world would have been done externally. He's implicitly saying, I can do these things internally. I can be your choir. I can make a moan upon the midnight hours. Again, these sensory details, he's not saying I will literally start moaning out loud. He is not saying I will literally play a lute or a pipe or swing incense from a censer. He is saying I can do these things symbolically. I can do these things inside because now I am in touch with my soul. This is the internalization, taking the external idea of the soul in the Greek world and turning it into what I think we think of as psyche, an internal, the description of an internal state, the internal soul, the internal mental state. That is what Keats is saying. He is taking those things from the external world and bringing them inside himself. And then we get the last stanza, the wonderful stanza, my favorite stanza of this poem, where, and again, it's the longest stanza. And here is my interpretation of the structure of this poem, right? So 5 stanzas, as we said. First stanza, he sets up, basically, his dream. Second stanza, he describes the forest, the dream world, Psyche, right? All the flowers that he sees. The third and fourth stanza, then, is where the poem pivots. The third stanza establishes the problem, so to speak, right? That Psyche was the last born of the Olympian gods, and she has no altar or temple. And then the fourth stanza pivots that and says, well, even if you don't have a temple, Psyche, I can be your temple. I will do it for you. And then the fifth stanza, I like to think of it as this ecstatic release, in which he starts to celebrate Psyche and essentially continues the idea that, okay, if he is going to build a temple to Psyche inside himself, if he is going to take the externalized Greek world and turn it into an internalized divine state, what will that look like? And we have this magnificent stanza that sums up the poem in a kind of, like I said, ecstatic celebratory release in what is also the longest stanza of the poem. So it's kind of this long flowing release of love and of union with the soul, which is, of course, what this poem is all about. So let's read it out loud and then let's break it down. Yes, I will be thy priest, and build a fane in some untrodden region of my mind, where branched thoughts, new grown with pleasant pain, instead of pines shall murmur in the wind. Far, far around shall those dark clustered trees fledge the wild-ridged mountains steep by steep. And there, by zephyrs, streams, and birds and bees, the moss-lain dryads shall be lulled to sleep. And in the midst of this wide quietness, a rosy sanctuary will I dress, with the wreathed trellis of a working brain, with buds and bells and stars without a name, with all the gardener fancy e'er could feign, who, breeding flowers, will never breed the same. And there shall be for thee all soft delight that shadowy thought can win, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in. All right, so let's break this down now. So it begins with this, again, this contrast between the external and the internal. The word fane, by the way, is just another old word for a temple of some kind. He's using it, I think, to create this rhyme with the word pain, right, in the third line. Where is he going to build this fane? He says, I'm going to build it in some untrodden region of my mind. So what he's doing in this final stanza is he's linking the internal and the external. Remember, in previous stanzas, he created this contrast between those two, right? The dream world in which he creates this forest. Now he's saying, here is how I'm going to kind of join and synthesize all of this together. He realizes I can take the external world of the Greeks that has faded, the external images associated with Greek worship and divine ritual, and I can make those things in my mind. And what he does is he links the two beautifully in this final stanza. So he's going to build a fane in his mind. And the instead of pine trees instead of pine trees around the fane, he's going to use his own thoughts. He describes branched thoughts, new grown with pleasant pain. So he creates this association between thoughts and trees. He even uses the word branched to describe, the way thoughts branch out, just like a tree. So he's going to do this throughout this stanza, linking the external, trees, forests, dryads, streams, etc., with the internal, with his mind and his thoughts. He says there will be zephyrs, streams, birds and bees, the dryads, which will be lulled to sleep. There will be all of the things around this fane that we associate with the Greek world. I'm going to put all of this in my mind. I'm going to create all of this through my imagination. And, I will dress up a rosy sanctuary. I'm going to create a temple, essentially, for you, a rosy sanctuary with the wreathed trellis of a working brain. So again, he links the external to the internal. He says the trellis, the wreaths that will be around the sanctuary will be my brain. My working brain will create the trellises. Once again, he connects his mind, the internal, to the images of Greek worship and divine ritual, the external. Now, there's a few interesting details here. He says, and stars without a name. Earlier, we had those two descriptions, not so much of stars, but of the Greek goddesses associated with the celestial bodies, Phoebe and Vesper. Here he says there will be stars, but they won't have a name. Why not? Because this will be his imagination. This will be a world of his creation in his mind, and the stars can be named whatever they want to be named. The next line, he describes fancy as a gardener. Now, fancy is one of these words that's associated today we really use it only to refer to kind of like the way someone looks physically or is dressed. It's kind of a positive description of how someone looks. But fancy really meant imagination. That was what it meant in older poetry. So what he's describing here is that he's saying my imagination is like a gardener. Fancy is a gardener, and it will be able to feign whatever I want. And now there was a wonderful wordplay here. The word feign, F-E-I-G-N, and earlier at the beginning, remember what word did he use for temple? He used the word feign, F-A-N-E. So we ask the question, why does he use the word feign at the beginning instead of temple? Yes, it's the rhyme scheme, but also he wants a wordplay with the word feign, F-E-I-G-N. Today, the word feign, F-E-I-G-N, is kind of negative. It means make something up, forge, fake, when you feign something, when you pretend. But for Keats, feigning something is what the imagination does. It makes stuff up. It invents things. It feigns things. Fancy, his imagination, is feigning things. And so the feign that he builds is constructed by his imagination. It is a feigned feign, so to speak, but he doesn't see that as a negative thing because to him, that is a tribute to the power of his imagination. His imagination is going to create or invent a sanctuary for Psyche that never existed in the real world, because by the time Psyche became a Greek goddess, the Greek world was fading. The temples were fading. So he says, I will feign a temple like that in my mind. I will feign a feign in my mind. Wonderful wordplay there, feign and feign. And of course, there is that alliterative connection to the word fancy as well. The final sections, the final lines, there shall be for thee all soft delight that shadowy thought can win. So remember, Psyche is associated with brightness, with light. Earlier, he used the word lucent, And he compared her to Phoebe, who was associated with brightness, and Vesper, the amorous glowworm of the sky, and said, Psyche is brighter than these two things. So Psyche, the soul, is associated with a certain brightness and light. And shadows and light are impossibly linked, of course, You cannot have light without shadows and vice versa. So he says, my thought is like a shadow, shadowy thought that will help create the soft delight for Psyche. So in other words, he is saying that the soul associated with brightness cannot exist without shadowy thought. Shadowy thought is necessary for the soul. And then, how does the poem end, An image of a bright torch, which is, of course, Psyche, you could say, brightness. a casement open at night, a window open at night to let the warm love in. It's this kind of sensual, sexual image at the end of the union between Cupid and Psyche. He's saying, in this temple, in my mind, that I will build, I will leave the window open to allow love, which is, of course, Cupid, the boy we saw earlier in the forest lying with Psyche, to let Cupid in. So why do we think Keats ends the poem with this particular image of Cupid and Psyche kind of reuniting in sensual pleasure through the open window of her temple, in the fane that he's built in his mind? Well, for a lot of poets, writers, intellectuals, etc., for a lot of people in the Greek world and then later, the union of Cupid and Psyche was symbolic. It was symbolic of kind of the soul's ascension to some extent. If Psyche is the soul, right, her marriage, her union with Cupid, or Eros, or love, was for the Greeks an essential kind of psychological transformation, you could say, that an individual undergoes. Psyche needs union with Cupid or love in order to rise to a higher plane. And later, among intellectuals in the Western world, right, in the 19th and 20th centuries, this union of Cupid and Psyche became symbolic of the soul's ascension. I'm not going to get too much into Neoplatonism or Gnosticism or any of those philosophies. Those are very fascinating. But a lot of those were all about the soul's ascension. How do you, as an individual, in this material world, achieve kind of higher divine spiritual ascension? Well, you have this symbolic union between Cupid and Psyche. In other words, right, starting in the 19th century and onward, especially with the Industrial Revolution, the world in some ways became more material. It started to feel more material. And a lot of artists really lamented the fact that in this new material, industrial 19th and 20th century world, the old spiritual values had disappeared. Well, as psychologists like Freud and Jung would argue, they didn't disappear. We just took those and internalized them. We took Psyche, the Greek goddess of the soul, and turned her into our idea of the psyche, the internalized soul. And for a lot of these writers and the thinkers, they would argue that those Greek goddesses, those stories that once were externalized, can still be read as symbols of internal transformations and internal spiritual ascensions. That's often how the union of Cupid and Psyche was symbolically understood in the context of this type of philosophy, a kind of challenge to the material world by saying, in the face of the material world, in the face of vulgar materialism, the Industrial Revolution and the 20th century, you can retain this spiritual ascension. You can attain this spiritual power in your soul through symbolic union of Cupid and Psyche. And that, I believe, is what Keats is describing here. The symbolic union of Cupid and Psyche at the end of Eros and the soul, of love and the soul, that is the culmination of Keats's own connection to the soul. So if we think about what happens in this poem, it describes Keats having a dream in which he sees Cupid and Psyche, and he decides to build a temple to Psyche in this forest to allow love to enter. He's basically, you could say symbolically, he's creating a sanctuary for his own soul inside his mind, inside himself. He is reaching, so what is the arc, you could say the character arc that our narrator, our speaker, our poet goes through in this poem? He is reaching a kind of spiritual, a deeper sense of spiritual meaning through this construction in his mind of an old-fashioned Greek temple for his own soul. Not only that, he is successfully drawing a connection between the Greek world and his own world. One of the reasons I love this poem so much, and one of the reasons it speaks to me so much, is I think it really touches on, it sort of solves a problem that has plagued people in the modern world. People always talk about the idea that spirituality has disappeared from the modern world. We're going to look at another poem later by Matthew Arnold called Dover Beach. And very famously, Dover Beach ends with this image of, there's this image of the sea of faith, right, which has disappeared. This idea that faith, spirituality in the Victorian era has gone away. We have lost touch with the old gods, with spirituality. And this is a thing people still think about today. A lot of writers write about the fact that in this sort of vulgar material age in which we live, there seems to be no room for the spirit anymore, for the old Greek values. As Keats notes in his poem, the Olympian world has in fact faded. The gods have disappeared. But what does Keats say is the solution? He says you can recreate the old Greek structures inside yourself, in your mind, and for your own soul. You can salvage that Greek world by bringing it inside. Keats is basically saying the old world has not disappeared. The old world has simply moved internally. It has moved inside us. What was once externalized and sensory has now become tuneless, right? Has now become internalized, but it has not disappeared. So Keats is essentially saying to us, build those fanes inside your mind. Build those temples to the soul inside your heart, inside of yourself. They have not disappeared. Don't let them disappear. You can salvage them. You can recreate them. Not only just recreate, because implicitly Psyche never had a temple in the Greek world because she arrived too late. You can create new temples, Keats is saying. New temples for the old gods inside your mind. And so it concludes with this really optimistic celebration of you could say the power of the soul and the power of the imagination, the power of the mind and the union it achieves with the soul, and then also with love at the end. The union of all of these abstract forces that Keats does such a brilliant job of externalizing and symbolizing. I just think it's also just such a beautiful image of what a sanctuary inside of you for the soul might look like. A Greek temple with moss-slain dryads, with buds and bells and stars without a name, with flowers, soft delight and shadowy thought, zephyrs, streams, birds, and bees. Very powerful and evocative set of images to imagine inside of your own mind and to say, yes, this is the peaceful forest fane where my soul resides, and it brings me peace to imagine it that way. All right, thank you all for listening. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share it, and I will see you all next time.